Welcome to the Enigmatic Muse of Bomarzo. This is Linda Lappin, author of Signatures in Stone, a Bomarzo mystery. Here with me today are Teresa Cutler-Broyles, author of Dante's Garden, Magic and Mystery in Bomarzo, best-selling author Gigi Pandian, author of Michelangelo's Ghost, and historical writer Mary Jane Cryan, author of many studies on Italian art, architecture, and culture, and especially on the Tuscia, where the sacred grove is located. Teresa Cutler-Broyles is visiting professor of creative writing at the Umbra Institute of Perugia, not far from where her latest book, Dante's Garden, takes place. She is the author also of One-Eyed Jack, a novel, and A Dream That Keeps Returning, essays on Italian travels, and also of numerous studies in film criticism, which she teaches at the University of New Mexico.
My relationship with this monster park, or the sacred wood, began in 2010 when I was in Italy with a group of authors, of which Rhonda was one. And we went there by accident, sort of. One of the people in the group found a brochure. So we went to the garden, never having heard of it before. And we got there, bought tickets, walked through the entrance, and everyone walked off and started talking and exclaiming over the statues and taking photos. And I just froze. It was as though I don't really know how to explain it exactly. It wasn't like there were ghosts. It wasn't like a deja vu or a past life experience, but there was some presence that I couldn't quite understand. And I kept thinking if I looked behind me quickly enough, I would see people dressed in 16th century clothing, or I would hear a conversation that was taking place underneath sort of all of the other conversations that were going on. So I walked around like that for about an hour while everyone else sort of went off and did their thing and took beautiful pictures of these immense statues and these gorgeous, just this gorgeous landscape. So when I got to the mouth of hell, which is one of the edifices, one of these statues that features, I think, in all of our books at some level, I walked inside and I thought, oh, wouldn't it just be amazing if I fell through time? And I woke up in 1570 and they were just either finishing the garden or it was there and it was brand new. Well, I didn't fall through time, but I did have an idea for a story. And that's where this story began. So that night, when we got back to town, I started doing research. And one of the fun things that I discovered, and it was fun and frustrating, was that there's not a lot known. There's a lot that's, I mean, historically, we know some things, and sorry about the light, guys. I'll talk about that. But one of the fun things is that we get to fill in a lot of the blanks. And for a writer, that's really fun because historical fiction is fiction after all. I did learn a few things. I learned who commissioned it, which was Vicino Orsini, but I didn't understand or learn exactly why. Maybe he built it for his wife who had died. Maybe he built it so he could seduce women, some parts of it. Maybe because he was a hunchback and possessed by demons, or maybe as a way to exorcise those demons. And again, it's unclear. I learned that the famed Piero Ligorio, who was an antiquarian, basically a historian and an archaeologist, was the garden designer and the sculptor, or maybe he wasn't. Maybe the sculptures were done by local workmen. Maybe it was a different sort of mysterious and unnamed sculptor that comes up in a couple of the books as well. So basically what I learned was that there was this great opportunity for me to create some magic and maybe bring people to this place that I had been to by words. So I began writing. I started going to this local coffee shop every Friday for 4 years. I would go in, I'd wheel my little roller bag of books and my maps, and I would take over the couch, and I got to know the baristas really well. And I wrote my book. I went back to the garden, a number of times. I wrote in the garden. There's a wonderful old bench that's there that I sat in for a day once and wrote. I stayed with a friend of Mary Jane's at her B&B and walked there and just had an amazing time. And the result was this book. And I saw Rhonda has a copy of it as well. So this book is the story of Frank Farnese, who's an interior designer and a book collector in 2017 in New York City. And it's also a story of Lucretia Romano, who is a young woman just shy of 20 years old, and she lives in Bolsena, which is in central Italy, in 1570. And neither of these two exist outside the pages of this book. but it's also about historical figures. Vicino Orsini is in it, soldier, duke, educated man, friend of popes, creator of the garden. Piero Ligorio, who, as I said, is the antiquarian and the archaeologist, who's a creator of maps of Rome and gardens in other areas of Rome. And in my book, at least, he's the designer of this one. And in a way, it's a story of Dante and his Divine Comedy as well. So this book begins in Bolsena. It's late summer, early autumn. Lucretia is sitting around reading a book in the sun, and Ligorio passes through on his way from the marble quarries up north, and he's going to to Bomarzo, to be with his friend Vicino Orsini and his wife and work in the garden. And he asks Lucretia, he says, why don't you come be my muse? He sort of falls in love with her platonically. He's much older. There's nothing between them in the book at all. She says, hey, I'll ask my parents. So her parents say, okay, the whole family goes. They get there just in time for the funeral of Orsini's wife. She has died. However, she's been planning a masquerade ball in the garden for months. So they decide to go ahead with that. The family stays. So that's where we are in 1570. Meanwhile, Frank hears of this amazing book that he wants. It is an interesting or strange copy of Dante's Divine Comedy. Some of the pages are upside down. There's some weird things about it, but he just decides he really wants it. So he goes to Florence and he goes to the couple who have it and he picks up the book and he experiences basically what I did in the garden. He feels that there's something more there, that he needs to know more about it. And in the front of the book is an inscription, and the inscription is addressed to a Francesco. It's signed by a nickname, L-U-C-I, Lucci. And the inscription mentions Bomarzo, and he asks his hosts, where is this place? They tell him about it, and he decides to go. 1550, we're back again. The masquerade has begun, music is playing, and a storm hits, and all the people run for shelter. 2017, Frank gets to the garden, walks around, again feels that strange presence. The storm hits. He takes shelter in the mouth of hell. He slips, he breaks, he hits his head and falls to the ground. When he wakes up and walks out, he's in 1570, where I wish that I had gone. So with that, I'm going to do a bit of reading, and Linda, we have like 12 or 13 minutes or so, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'll do a bit of reading, and it's essentially, I'm taking sections that have sort of moved us to this place, so it doesn't happen quite this quickly, but it gives you an idea of what's going on. All right. Frank looked back out along the avenue of stone vases, and his breath caught. At the end, between and half hidden by two tall trees, was a beautiful woman's face, framed by lush stone curls. He climbed down quickly and hurried toward the sculpture. The sun, nearing the western horizon, lit the air with a golden light and sent long shadows across the ground, dappling through the leaves. When he pushed through the shrubs that surrounded the two trees, he saw that the stone woman sat in a bowl or pond and balanced a vessel of some kind on her head. He stared at the stone face, soft and weather-worn. Its expression was serene, as though the statue surveyed all she saw and was content. The eyes were elegantly carved, half in shadow. Looking at him, he blinked and looked down to the torso, where breasts were still discernible, and at the legs that seemed to flow from the earth, and back to the eyes. "You're beautiful," he said aloud. He couldn't shake the feeling that the statue was watching him, and for a moment he was caught, ensnared, and could not look away. Strains of music drifted to him, a violin, a cello, other instruments he didn't recognize, all playing a composition he had never heard before. He closed his eyes with an effort, and when he opened them, the spell was broken. Even the music was no more. Thunder, distant but distinct, rolled across the sky. A breeze kicked up. Rain? He held his book closer, glad it was encased in plastic. He looked around again, and his breath caught. Half hidden by trees and hanging leaves, not far away, a huge stone face rose from the earth. No, not a face exactly, more a huge gaping mouth with eyes. Wide stone steps led from an open area ringed with tall trees to the bottom of the mouth. The eyes stared at him, and he could almost hear an echo of a scream from the bowels of the earth. He shuddered and stumbled back. "Madonna," he whispered. A cloud drifted over the sun, throwing the gaping mouth into shadow and sending an instant chill through the air. Another rumble of thunder. Without the sun to light it, the mouth seemed even more ominous. Some things happened a little bit later on. The rain fell harder. A quick look around. The only possible shelter was that giant mouth. He ran toward it, hesitated at the bottom of the stairs. It gaped, nothing inside but inky darkness. Simultaneous thunder and lightning made up his mind, and he bolted upward. The stairs were worn smooth by the years and led him quickly to the edge of the mouth. Ominously, 2 stones hung from the top of the opening like jagged teeth. He stopped, far more hesitant to enter than he could explain away. It was simply a stone creature, nothing more. Shelter. Another flash illuminated words carved in the stone over the top of the mouth. Abandon all thought, ye who enter here, he whispered, almost the same words Dante saw over the gates of hell. He couldn't breathe. The book burned his skin and he gasped. Lightning again rent the sky, hit a tree a stone's throw away. Thunder crashed simultaneously and rolled over him and shook the ground. He dove into the mouth. The darkness inside was complete, thick, the air smoldering. He lost his footing, tripped, stepped forward into nothing. He heard shouts and screams from far, far away. His last conscious move was to pull the burning Dante away from his chest. His fingers lost their grip and the book fell. He fell after it and fell and fell. So 2017, perhaps transitioning into the past. And in the past, the masquerade is going on. And imagine they're outside in an outside amphitheater. The torches are burning. It's a beautiful night. Everyone is dressed in beautiful clothing and silks and have masks on, and music is playing. Lucretia's heart beat in time with the rich tones of the clavichord. As an undertone, it engendered an odd mix of both joy and sadness, and she wondered suddenly if the piece had been slowed down or shifted somehow to reflect the death of the woman in whose honor it had been written. The lovely sounds drifted over them all, embracing the guests and turning the small, torchlit theater into a timeless, magical place. Then from behind them, voices began to sing. The guests murmured and looked up. Unseen until now, a number of men and a few women stood atop the wall behind the theater. They were fantastical in the flickering light, dressed in black and red, and their voices rose with the music. Lucretia looked at the Duke and saw tears on his cheeks. Her own breath caught and she looked away. The music and the voices rose and rose, beauty and sorrow entwined, and it seemed to go on forever. Next, we're in a print shop in Venice, 1560. The entire shop was worse than stuffy. Ink fumes and bodily odors swirled and mixed and were almost palpable, and it was miserably hot. They'd needed to stoke the fire in the corner constantly to keep the ink at the right consistency. Nonstop work for the last week meant they'd be done with this damned infernal book on time, but Marco was sure he wouldn't recover from this experience anytime soon. Exhausted, odoriferous, and hot, he was more than ready to be done. Giuseppe placed the sheet of expensive paper carefully in the holder and held his breath as he clamped down the edges. The boss had made it clear that no mistakes were allowed. They were under a time constraint and the components were expensive. Marco grasped the lever and pulled it toward him. The paper lowered toward the plate. The fire popped. Outside, thunder rumbled over the city and the day darkened suddenly as if clouds had obscured the sun. The paper made contact with the plate. The fire roared, flames leaped upward. As if from heaven itself, a bolt of lightning rent the sky. Thunder clapped mere seconds later. Marco kept his hands steady and pulled hard. He needed to be sure to get even pressure. Smoke rose from under the paper. What in God's name? Giuseppe said hoarsely. The lever grew hot and hotter and burned Marco's hand. He swore and moments later released it. It smoked as he stared at his palm. The burn there faded even as he watched until the skin was unbroken and unblemished. Even the ink had been seared away. And then quickly we're back in the garden. The storm has started. Everyone has broken away from the music and run to take shelter in this crooked house that is there. It was built that way. And Lucretia and Ligorio stood side by side at the upper story window. A violent flash ripped across the sky and thunder roared seemingly overhead. Lucretia flinched and blinked, and a man was standing in the middle of the clearing, looking right at her. His arms hung at his sides, and he didn't move even as the storm raged around him. His very odd clothes clung to him even in the wind, and he looked like he'd come from the garden itself, an apparition made of flesh and stone. Oh, Lucretia whispered. She couldn't tell whether she felt terrified or something else.
Mary Jane Cryan, American-Irish writer and historian, has been living in Italy since 1965. An international educator, researcher, and writer, she has also been an official Vatican guide, site director, and lecturer for Elder Hostel, and the creator of startups for numerous American universities, high schools, writers, and artists' workshops. Since 2008, she's been an enrichment lecturer aboard luxury cruise ships and has published more than 10 books on Italian art and culture, including Affreschi, Travel History and Itineraries in Central Italy, and Etruria Storia Segreti. Her books may be ordered directly from her website and are also found on Amazon.
Actually, I'm very glad that Teresa started, because her book is called Dante's Garden. And actually, that's about the only way you could actually understand this whole garden, because it's similar to what Dante wrote about, traveling through up a pyramid from the entrance up to understanding knowledge. And that's probably what Vicino Orsini wanted. That's probably what he actually planned it that way. Because from the latest historical research, there's a book that's just come out recently by Antonio Rocca. It's about the hermetical explanation for the garden, Bomarzo Ermetica. And he explains that the theater, she mentioned also the theater where the people were dancing. That theater was his clue to find out, what did Vicino Orsini want to do? What did he want to say with this garden? If we think of the word theater, back in those days, back in the early Renaissance, the whole idea of a theater, teatro, was a complex of knowledge, like this, the Teatro of the Seashells or the Teatro delle Acque. And his theater is the theater connected with all of the knowledge. It's the complex of knowledge. And I won't be able to explain it, because it's you have to have the idea of how people thought about the religion, the philosophy of that time. So what the hidden significance of the Sacro Bosco is, according to Antonio's research, it's based on a book by a 16th century Venetian humanist, Giulio Camillo Dalminio, or from Dalmatia. And Giulio Camillo was a very close friend of Vicino Orsini, and they met in Venice. So his Idea del Teatro is a complex of the things that have been forgotten as the end of the Renaissance came about and the Reformation. All of these hermetic things, and also the spiritualists that were meeting always in Viterbo, all of that was sort of like hidden away. It was a garden or a scene, a place to arrive to knowledge that was only for the initiated. So the theater is the complex of knowledge, a map or a key to the universe, only for the initiated. All of the theater of the Sacro Bosco, you should enter at a certain point. And originally there were the two sphinxes at the entrance. But over the centuries, after Vicino's death, all of this was forgotten and sort of nobody could really understand it. That's why it's become a very good place for authors, imagination of writers to put their own, like Teresa said, put their own inside and come up with uses for this garden. Actually, what Vicino did, every figure, every sculpture in this esoteric garden leads to the next level. So you should do a voyage all the way up to the top, up to where the temple is, which was then the tomb of the wife of Vicino's wife. That was the last thing that was done. And originally that Casa Pendente, the leaning house, he dedicated that to his good friend, Cardinal Madruzzo, because all of these people who are interested in the Hermetic and interested in these esoteric things were very good friends, and they traded off also their sculptors. For example, the man who sculpted for Madruzzo his fountain in Soriano. Have you ever seen it? The Papacqua fountain, that huge complex. Probably the same man who worked on that also then went over to Bomarzo and sculpted some of the objects, the sculptures in his garden. So it's sort of like this journey, this upward journey that Dante takes us on in the Divina Commedia. In fact, this Giulio Camillo, his book, Idea del Teatro, was based on this whole idea of 7 columns of this temple of knowledge. And he actually built a little wooden model for this theater, this idea of how these different groups under different goddesses or planets. And then the 6 steps of the theater, which is slanted, by the way. I don't remember because it's been a while. I haven't gone inside the theater, but you couldn't actually use it as a theater because it's slanted down. And there are 6 steps that lead up to these columns and these personaggi that are up in the proscenium. So it leaves a lot of things open for people nowadays. It was completely forgotten, you know, from about 1600 till recently, the 1940s. Nobody even went there. It was used for the local people would bring their sheep to graze there. And many of the statues and sculptures were tossed down into the river underneath. So it was only in the 1949, 50 that the Bettini family took it over, bought it from I think it was the Lante della Rovere family who owned it. And then they started dragging these pieces that were lost down, had rolled down the hill, and trying to put them back where they thought they went. But not all of the sculptures were actually placed where Vicino Orsini had originally wanted them to be. So it's complicated, even more complicated now, because if you follow Camillo, Giulio Camillo's book, The Theater of the Teatro l'Idea del Teatro, it should have done one way up the hill, up the different steps. Nowadays, it's sort of very easy to get off his original voyage or travel. So each figure is sort of like you might say, frozen in stone, or a mirror in stone of what Giulio Camillo did in his book Il Teatro. And this was only recently worked on by Francis Yates, who was a researcher in is it called the, oh dear, what's the name of that? Warburg Institute in London. And then, of course, other people have taken over. I know Salvador Dali was enamored. He loved it. Mario Prats went there and he said, this is so alien to Italian art, because nobody really remembered anymore what the original books were like in the 1500s, and which Vicino based his idea of a garden. And not only is there the Bomarzo, you writers have got lots of other places that you can, I want to see a whole series of books coming out, I hope, about some of the other wonderful gardens, because it's one of 4 very, very important gardens done at the same time by other important characters. Their idea was also to amuse their friends, to show off to their friends, and also to have parties, probably like the one that Teresa described. While he was, after he did his, at the same time, more about the same time, actually right after, his daughter, Vicino's daughter, Ottavia, married, and she went to live in Vignanello. She was Vicino's, one of the daughter that really was interested in the garden, and she made her own garden right next door to the castle that she lived in Vignanello. Have you all been to visit the Vignanello castle and the gardens? If not, that's to be the second one. So you go to see from father to daughter. And she also put in the boxwood and the hedges, the initials, her own initials, and the ones of her children. And this is still exactly the way it was when she had it built and when she just created it in the 1580s. And it's still nowadays is taken care of by the gardener Santino. And he uses the only tool that they used in those days, which was a scythe, just a hand cutting. He cut it all by hand. And it keeps the boxwood exactly the way it was when it was first created. So that's at Vignanello, another beautiful garden. And it was a private garden for their family. And it can be visited also when everything opens up again. The third garden came a little bit later. That's Villa Lante in Bagnaia. And here we have lots more water, lots of water fountains, along with the boxwood and the sculptures but more than sculptures of characters, the fountains are made like a chain. There's the rope or chain fountain that comes down from the hill. Also, Castello Ruspoli, she was able to use water from nearby, because the interesting thing about all of these gardens, they're not like what English people or American people think of when they think of gardens. There's very few flowers. It's mostly box hedges and structures and fountains and sculptures. And the fourth, of course, some of you can visit this one if you haven't already. It's called the Gardens of Palazzo Farnese e Caprarola. Have you all been to visit that one? You can do it the same day, really in a hurry. You can do one and the other. Okay, so those are the four special gardens right close to each other. And they all have a connection because they're friends, they were relatives. And I think that it's one of those hidden, like Teresa mentioned, you didn't even know it existed when you first came with your first friends and visited the gardens, because they were there, but they're not overly, it's not a Jurassic Park or a Disneyland, although some people can go and visit the Bomarzo Gardens with children, and the children have a great time because for them it's like a playground. So you can visit these gardens on all different levels. We'll never be able to understand them the way that Vicino and his friends did, because they had their 16th century mindset. They had their whole idea of hermetic secret and esoteric, which you had to understand the religious situation of the time and what he had been through as a traveler and as a man of arms, because he was always away fighting. He was a mercenary soldier. And of course, when he came back, he was probably very much affected by the rest of the area around his castle, around Bomarzo. And in order to really get the feeling of what the landscape is like, I would recommend that you go, when we finish this talk, go on Google and open up Project Tuscia. Project Tuscia is a fascinating project done by a very young man who lives in Bomarzo with drones. And he has taken his drone and he has seen this all in a completely different way. And so he goes with his drone around, he doesn't go into the gardens, but he goes to all of the areas around Bomarzo, the town, the castle up on top, which is very foreboding. I mean, if you go there on a cold winter night and try and walk through the center of Bomarzo, it's quite scary, and gives you that feeling that you people in your books have brought out. You've captured it very well and translated it into words, which is what this young man that did Project Tuscia does with his drone. He brings you into the areas that could have been just like the Sacro Bosco before Vicino actually went and had the sculptors work on them, because there are all of these very, very quiet, they might have been medieval or they might have been Etruscan sites with structures, with stones that have also been worked by people, but in the Etruscan times or the Middle Ages. So make sure you get a look at this Project Tuscia and just check out the one that says Bomarzo, and then you can look at the others, because he's done a magnificent job showing this area with the other sites that are similar to Bomarzo's garden, but in a modern way. So he's given us another way to see it. You've done it through your books. Vicino did it. He translated the book of L'Idea del Teatro into stone so it could stay around for a long time, even if most of us, for centuries, nobody really understood what is the meaning behind it. So I thank my author friends. I only do nonfiction, and I'm really in awe of anybody who has such fantasy that they can put it into an interesting story. My stories are based on just facts and things that I've discovered in researching on documents. So I'm glad to see that we all got together today, and hopefully it will incite other people to come and to write about some of these other gardens and also to visit this area when we can, because we're all dying to have our friends from America and from England to come back again. Okay, I think that's all I want to say. But if anyone has questions, we'll be here at the end. Okay, thank you, Linda.
So the depth psychologist Carl Jung, in discussing medieval treatises of alchemy, says the reason that they seem so mysterious to us today is because we've lost the key to the pictorial code that's used in encoding these particular messages. And that's sort of how I feel about the Bomarzo Sacred Grove, is that the first time that you go and all later successive visits, you feel like there's a meaning in all this, but it eludes you. It's all so mysterious, but you remain puzzled because you have no idea what that key could possibly be, because the images of the statues work upon your mind like images from dreams. They work upon your unconscious. And there's an interesting quote from Mary Butts, a British modernist writer who was one of the inspirations for my novel. And she says, "There are places that are signatures. I do not mean where one has lived continually or where important affairs have happened, but a place felt to be significant and passionately and irrationally cherished." And I think the word here, significant and irrationally cherished, are very important. So as has been suggested by Mary Jane, there's some evidence that alchemists were active in the Tuscia in the 16th century and later, and that Vicino may have been part of a group of intellectuals who were attracted to alchemy. Some of the statues and some of the inscriptions may bear reference to alchemical concepts and alchemical figures. And we know that alchemy wasn't only about changing metals or elements into gold. It was also a metaphor for a very complex psychological process of individuation, as Jung termed it later on, a process of fulfillment of one's being, of one's potential, of development of one's awareness, and of self-knowledge. And so that's how I see it in Signatures in Stone. The main character, Daphne, must go through an alchemical or spiritual transformation in order to stay alive, but also to solve a mystery that happens, a murder that happens in the garden. And each statue marks a particular phase in that journey towards her individuation, her coming to self-knowledge. So another aspect of this particular park, which fascinates me, along with many of the others in that area that Mary Jane mentioned already, Villalante, Vignanello, Caprarola, and so on, is that we can consider these gardens like picture books in stone. They contain stories with a beginning, a middle, and an end. They're peopled with characters, which are the statues, and also with events, again, statues, or also fountains or architectural elements or topographical elements. But the main character, the narrator, the author of every individual reading of this particular book of stone is, of course, the visitor to the garden. And that idea really fascinates me. And everyone's experience is unique as they go through the garden, and then they must come to terms with each of these different figures, which represent mythological deities as well as historical figures and so on. So learning to read this garden as a text can be life-changing, and it may reveal something to you of your real nature, or give you an insight into the real nature of things, into the real meanings of things. And this is what happens to my character Daphne in Signatures in Stone. So in this novel, Daphne is a mystery writer who goes to Bomarzo with a group of friends, with an artist and with her publisher, to write a new book. But a murder takes place in the garden, which has been allowed to become all overgrown. And she must help solve the crime for which she's one of the prime suspects. In the story, the garden has in fact become, as she mentions, totally overgrown. And an American art historian, Professor Feinstone, is assisting the owners in restoring it to its former glory. And he's also working on a monograph about the identity of the artist who designed the garden, which he believes will be earth-shattering. And that also refers to some theories that Mary Jane is well informed about, of who was the real brains behind the garden and what it was supposed to represent. So I'm going to read a very short section from Signatures in Stone. in which Daphne goes, makes her first tour of the garden in the company of Finestone. And while this is happening, the garden is, the statues are slowly being uncovered of their greenery, discovered and interpreted by Professor Finestone. And so this is her first visit to the garden. Before stepping inside, I held my breath for a second, as a swimmer might do before a dive. Immediately, I felt the air drop in temperature a degree or two. A chill flickered through my knees, up my spine, and across my scalp, though there was no logical explanation for such a sharp change. Finestone paused on the threshold as if waiting to see my reaction, then stepped in behind me, seized my arm, and began my guided tour. In the mid-16th century, when this place was created, parks and gardens were meant to offer more than just an aesthetic experience, a pleasant promenade in the shade or a showcase for flower beds. They were models of the cosmos and also tools for altering one's consciousness, possibly for changing one's destiny. Entering a place like this was like succumbing to a dream. Every detail was intended to produce a specific effect on the mind and body, to excite and soothe the senses like a drug, to awaken the unconscious self. The colors, textures, odors, and shapes of the plants, like yew and mistletoe and belladonna, all capable of inducing catatonia, nightmares, and prophetic dreams, contributed to create such an impression, along with the tinkling of running water and the cries and shrieks of exotic birds kept captive here in aviaries. All this was intended to catapult the visitor into a primordial state of awareness. Closing his eyes, Finestone snorted in short gusts of air like a yogi, as if to force oxygen straight to his brain. I too inhaled deeply the fragrance of the dew-drenched vegetation surrounding us. Clumps of laurel, rosemary, ilex, juniper, pine, moss, fennel, rocket, and wild mint exuded their perfumes. Above our heads, crows cawed in the treetops. It truly seemed an enchanted place. A few feet away from where we stood, a trail snaked through the underbrush. He motioned for me to follow as he loped along with his cane. The path wove in between bushes and outcroppings of rock, where ferns lashed out in our faces and thorns ripped our clothes. Picking our way through the fronds and brambles, we reached the Sphinx I had noted the evening before, situated in a small clearing from where an even narrower trail wound into the interior. Not far off, we could hear the men working. This Sphinx is probably a copy of a genuine Etruscan piece from Vicino's collection of antiquities, Finestone said. The surrounding hills and valleys are full of Etruscan tombs that must have provided an endless source of income to the Duke. Such artifacts were prized highly by his aristocratic cohorts, who used them to decorate their homes and sold them at great profit to English ladies of fashion. Many collectors and museums today would pay a pretty penny to add this to their collection. Here she crumbles beneath rain and cold and lichen. Pensively, he patted the Sphinx's haunches. Set here at the entryway, she suggests that this place is a riddle the visitor must solve. An inscription, barely visible, encrusted with moss and lichen, was chiseled on the base of the statue. I deciphered the letters and read aloud. Tu che eri qui, tu che c'entri qui, pon mente parte a parte e dimmi poi se tante meraviglie siano fatte per inganno o pur per arte. I've entered a partial translation. You who enter, tell me whether these marvels have been created through deceit or art. Was the Monster Park a sort of trick or illusion? A flight of fancy only meant to entertain? Or did it artfully conceal a deeper meaning? Pone mente parte a parte, I repeated. This was what I did not understand. Literally, the words meant, put your mind side to side. Could it mean that the visitor must examine all sides, or that one should stand outside oneself when making judgments? Perhaps, said Feinstein, it is asking us to set aside the rational mind and not to make our final judgment until we have seen and pondered the whole. With a sweeping gesture, he embraced the park that lay before us, still immersed by copious vegetation, from which emerged a few rough sculptures and massive boulders resembling forlorn islands rising from a flake of green. But she is only the preamble to this eccentric representation of hell on earth, as you will see, he said. The horrific statues carved here may be viewed as fragments of consciousness itself, the residue of violent emotions. The local peasants once believed, he said, that the statues came to life at night. Were they not held down and impeded by all these brambles and vines, they might break loose and go marauding about the town. After all, the ancient Egyptians knew how to breathe life into their statues of the gods and performed special rites for this purpose. Perhaps this knowledge was preserved and transmitted to the Romans and then down to us through the Renaissance. Perhaps Vicino himself, or more likely the artist who sculpted them, knew the secret art of animating statues. And there I'll stop because it's sort of connected in with Gigi's book, The Art of How Statues Were Animated in Bomarzo. Gigi Pandian is a USA Today best-selling and an Agatha Award-winning mystery author, a breast cancer survivor, and an accidental almost vegan. She's the child of cultural anthropologists from New Mexico and the southern tip of India, and spent her childhood traveling around the world on their research trips. She now lives in the San Francisco Bay Area with her husband and a gargoyle who watches over the garden. Her award-winning books include The Accidental Alchemist, The Masquerading Magician, The Lost Gargoyle of Paris, and many others.
Listening to you read just now, I haven't read your book in several years. I want to go back and reread it now. So yeah, this has been such fun. And I have to say, I'm also envious that Teresa got to work on her novel actually in the park. Yeah. I got to visit, and Linda generously invited me over as well while I was in town, because I was just visiting for a short trip. I live in Northern California. But I love to travel to do research for my mysteries. And one of the things that has always fascinated me is because I come from an academic background, and there's so many unanswered questions of history. And I've always been drawn to mystery novels as well, because of all of there's so much mystery in the world. And so what I love to do when I travel and when I research and when I write is look at what we actually know about history and then use my imagination to fill in the gaps about what if. And so I always have an author's note in the end of my books that talks about what history in the books is real versus what is made up. And it's always about 95% real, that there is so much fascinating historical discoveries that always make their way into my books, but then the actual mystery is that small question of what if. So Michelangelo's Ghost is one of the books in my Jaya Jones, reflection there, in my Jaya Jones Treasure Hunt mystery series. And Jaya Jones is a history professor who solves present day crimes linked to treasures from India's colonial history. And so I love looking for cross-cultural connections across history and in the present day. And I always look for that when I'm traveling as well, that it's so fascinating that even before travel was so easy, that people really did travel across the world and bring different ideas home with them. And as all of the other speakers have mentioned already, that the mysterious Vicino Orsini, that we really don't know the exact details about the garden that were that were created. And so, yeah, I've just loved doing research here. And the idea for Michelangelo's ghost was that Jaya, in this book, an old mentor of hers, a professor of history, has discovered a secret about the Park of Monsters, but her advisor is murdered before she can look into it. And so Jaya has to solve the mystery herself and figure this out. So she and her friends travel to Italy's Park of Monsters to unravel a supposed ghost that is haunting the Park of Monsters, who she doesn't believe is actually a ghost, but someone who is after something else. So all of my mysteries are lighthearted adventures that bring in things like that. And so I'll just read a couple of pages from a scene in the book where they haven't been able to discover, they are looking for a hidden art studio that is that is possibly there in the sacred wood, because there is so much there that, as others have mentioned, that the garden was forgotten for so many centuries, that there could have been so many things when it was rediscovered and cleared away, but that there are still so many mysteries hidden there. So Jaya and her friends are now sneaking back into the Park of Monsters at close to midnight, when they are not supposed to be there, but to continue their search. And so before I read one last thing, you will see how much of an impact the park made on me, that this is my fireplace screen behind me here, if you can see the ogre from the park. So I blew that up from and had it printed on canvas from a photo that I took when I visited, because it is something for, if any of you haven't visited there, you definitely have to go sometime. Okay. We arrived at the Park of Monsters after 11 o'clock and fell silent as we reached the entrance. Instead of trying to break into the main entry gate, we circled the sprawling park until we saw a thick covering of trees that would obscure our hopping the fence. I tossed the rope ladder we'd made up the top bars, climbed over, and pulled up the rope ladder onto the other side of the wall. Though we'd planned for the clandestine visit with black clothing, gloves, and flashlights, we hadn't done the type of reconnaissance Lane would have done if he'd been here with me. I hoped we were properly disguised in case there were video cameras. We'd mapped out a path of stone structures that were likely candidates for a clue to Lazaro's studio: the ogre, Proteus, and Pegasus. At night, I was especially struck by the fact that none of the sculptures looked quite like Lazaro's sketches. I knew creatives had always used artistic license, but it makes the work of a historian that much more difficult. With clouds above, it was effectively a moonless night, so we were forced to use our flashlights. In the darkness, the harsh beams of light bouncing off the stone monoliths created an eerie sensation, as if we were slicing pinpricks of light through Dante's Inferno. Since the garden was laid out on multiple levels, we had to watch for stone steps that appeared in unexpected places. In the forest that had overtaken the majority of the sculpture garden, we would never have found the creatures we sought with our maps. Even though the gardens had been restored over 50 years ago after being lost to overgrowth for 5 centuries, nature still reigned supreme in this sacred wood. Nearly 500 years, Ava murmured. You think we can find it? I think we want to go this way. We cut across the path too soon. How did we get so turned around? This place is a maze, Mahilan grumbled. He continued to do so as we hopped a low fence leading to one of the creatures we wanted to examine, Proteus. I checked the rocky areas of land near the sea monster raising its head from the earth, and also the mouth of the carving itself to make sure there weren't any moving pieces in the stone. Had the park's creator, Vicino Orsini, kept his fellow outcast Lazaro in mind when constructing his sculpture garden? Or had the studio grotto been added later? Vicino had built the park in the 1550s, shortly after Lazaro returned from India. I didn't want to destroy anything, so I gingerly went over all the points in stone that I thought might give way as part of the original design. Nothing here. I sat down on the grass that served as the sea monster's ocean in front of its giant mouth. What was that? Mahilan whipped around his head and squinted into the darkness. A twig snapped. I swear I heard a twig snap. It's like something is stalking us. You didn't hear, I began. I heard it too, Ava said. She clicked off her flashlight. Turn off your flashlights. I stood up and found my brother's hand. We stood in darkness for several minutes with no sound except our breathing. My eyes adjusted to the near black darkness, but I could make out shadows that I knew must be Mahilan and Ava. But without any detectable features, in this macabre park, they looked more like faceless monsters. Shouldn't we? Mahilan whispered. Shh. Ava and I both cut him off. But look, Ava whispered. She raised her arm, pointing towards the hill above us. I could make out the shadow of her arm well enough to see the spot she had indicated. Then I wished my eyes hadn't adjusted, because there, atop the mound above the sea monster, a translucent figure walked across the earth. It can't be, Mahilan said. It's the ghost. The apparition was still for a moment and then headed right for us. And I will stop there.